Hey guys, so welcome back. So in this video, I'll just quickly lay out the path I'm going to take to get through and to bring contributions into some kind of order to make it a little bit understandable. So I'm just going to follow the broad outline of the chapter headings that are in the contributions. And it will go like this. The resonating will be first, then we'll have the interplay, then the leap, the grounding, the future ones, the last God, and then being as appropriating event. So there are seven headings, seven titles under which I'm going to structure this video series, and they all of these topics feature in kind of the big picture, like I said in the last video, the big picture view of Heidegger's whole thought. And that's why I think this book is so important and useful for someone studying Heidegger, because it really, I think it's the first time he lays out everything clearly in one place like this. So I really think this book is a must read, I think, if you're looking to understand Heidegger post Being and Time. So we'll start with the resonating. So that's where we are now. And before we get into the resonating and describe what this is, we should just point out that modern everyday life has been characterized for Heidegger by this forgottenness of being. Which means that we no longer question things as to their essence. And when I say being, I mean B-E-Y-N-G, being with a Y. So we no longer look at things as what they really are. We interpret things based on other, more, say, utilitarian principles, practical principles, how we can use things. That approach to life, we generally have that now. So Heidegger characterizes this as a forgottenness of being with a Y. So he says beings have been abandoned by being with a Y. And we live in a world, therefore, bereft of essences. And this situation, the abandonment of beings by being with a Y, Heidegger calls the plight. So we're in the plight at the moment. And in the plight, like I said before, beings are reduced to, or beings have been stripped of their essence. They're reduced to mere objective presence. So that's a word from Being and Time. They're just objectively present things. They're just objects in the world that we can use. There's nothing more to them than that. And he also calls them objects of machination, and we'll look at that in just a moment, actually, what that exactly means. So interestingly, he says Christianity is partly to blame for this, or he puts part of the blame at Christianity's doorstep. And the reason is that if you have a dogma that says, or a doctrine that says God made all beings, then that's how we interpret beings. Beings are these things made by God. And again, with that understanding in mind, with that approach to the world, you're not investigating beings as beings. You're investigating them as beings made by God. So Heidegger sees that as already bypassing the beings as essence. We're not looking at them as beings, we're looking at them as things created by God. And so we've already kind of overlaid an interpretive schema on things rather than approaching them in their essence, as to their essences. So God made all beings, and in addition to this, God then is now proclaimed as the essence of being with a Y. So God is the source of everything. God is the reason why there are beings. And And since that's the case, we no longer need to question being. We don't have to wonder what it is. We don't have to look any further because we know what it is. It's God. Now we can ask about God, but in doing that, again, we've already overlaid a schema on reality, and then we're looking to explain it in terms of that schema. And so again, we've bypassed the essence of reality. Just to put a finer point on there, being with a Y then turns out to be just another being, albeit a supernatural one. And so, like I said, we've just missed. Christianity has taken us down this path where we've not only bypassed beings themselves as to their essence, we've also bypassed being itself. So that was interesting. So we've got the plight, where beings have been abandoned by being. But he also talks then about the greatest plight. And the greatest plight is the lack of a sense of plight in the midst of this plight. So the greatest plight is basically we're in the plight, but we don't realize we're in it. And that's the biggest problem here. He gives 3 reasons for this. The first is calculation. The second is speed. And the third is the massive. So briefly what those are. Calculation is the idea that everything is calculable and therefore measurable and therefore certain. So there's no sense of the impossible anymore, no sense of boundaries or limits. Everything is reducible to this kind of utilitarian calculation. All beings can be reduced to this common factor, and it's like a leveling down. Everything is possible, and if it's not possible, it will be possible at some later date. So again, so this is not to say that that's a bad thing as such. The idea that science and scientific achievements are bad, I don't think that's the point. The point is that with that approach to reality, with that approach to beings, we lose a dimension. We lose the deeper level, the essence of the being. We bypass that. We miss that. So it's more like keeping that scientific calculative approach in check, balancing it with this other approach that looks to being itself. So that's one reason why we're in this plight, is calculation. Everything's been reduced to economic considerations. Speed is the second one. And this is our constant need to be engaged in activity and bustle and our almost pathological fear of boredom, which this is something that Heidegger talked about in Being and Time as well, with things like idle talk and chatter and that kind of thing. So that has also contributed to the plight. And the final thing is the massive. And this is exactly what I talked about in the last video when we talked about the gigantic. So it's the way quantity has become the most important quality of things. Now it's not about what things really are, it's about how much we have of it, or how much we can achieve with this. It's all about quantity rather than quality. And so after that kind of long prelude, it's at this point that we can get to what the resonating is. So we're lost in the plight. We talked about the greatest plight, and at this point the resonating starts. And what it is, I'll give you a quote and then we'll look at that in a bit more detail. So Heidegger says, resonating of the essential occurrence of being out of the abandonment by being through the compelling plight of the forgottenness of being. And the way Heidegger writes that, it's kind of a poetic structure. So Heidegger liked poetry, so I guess that's where that comes from. But anyway, so that's what the resonating is. What does that all mean? Well, the way I've broken it down is we could say what resonates, what's doing the resonating. And Heidegger says that what's doing it is being with a Y, or more precisely, the essential occurrence of being, which tells us that, or hints at the idea that being's not just going to be another being. Being with a Y is not just going to be another thing. It's something deeper than that. It's more than that. Perhaps a verb rather than a noun, an event, say. And that's what we'll talk about more about that later. But that's what resonates. Being with a Y, the occurrence of being. And the way I like to think of this is it's resonating. Resonating sounds like kind of like a pulsing with significance or relevance. So there's being, the occurrence of being is kind of brought back into our awareness. That's what I think of as the resonating, this idea that we've been lost in the plight, and now being itself is starting to assert itself once more. It's becoming more relevant and significant to us. So where does the resonating come from? Well, it comes from out of the plight. It comes from being in the plight. That's where the resonating starts. And what's the goal of the resonating? To bring back being in its full essential occurrence as event. Cool. So it's like a call. It's like a call back to being itself, to the source. You can probably draw connections with that. Now that I say it, I think of it, the call of conscience, which Heidegger talked about in Being and Time, calling to Dasein, a call to Dasein from Dasein, to reawaken Dasein in its as authentic, and that's really what we're talking about here too. He talks about repetition a little bit, and it's worth mentioning. Repetition is an idea that I assume Heidegger got this from Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard talks about repetition in a kind of a different way, but it's interesting again to see that parallel crop up. For Kierkegaard, it's like repetition. If something is able to allow, or if something allows of repetition, it's genuine, it's truth, it's subjective, and that which is for Kierkegaard is truth, and that's because it's not locked in time. It's not an event that happened in history. And the example I think he gives is of love and, say, getting married. The marriage, the wedding, is an event that happened in time, that's historical. But what's not historical is the love that the couple share. And that is a repetition because it's something you always have to continually address and feel. You have to engage with that feeling again and again throughout your entire life. It's not an event that's kind of over and done with and historical. So that's Kierkegaard anyway. For Heidegger, it's quite different. And the definition I've got is a quote which I'll read for you. Repetition is to let the same, the uniqueness of being become a plight again, and thereby out of a more original truth. Man, I butchered that. So basically what it means, repetition, is to re-encounter being with a Y, and therefore to experience a deeper, more original truth. So I think the way Heidegger uses it, it's like just a re-encountering with being. So we've kind of gone off on this tangent down into the plight, and now the repetition is to come back to being itself, being with a Y, and engage with it again, but this time in a deeper, more original way. An interesting thing that that comes out in this section too is Heidegger talks about Nietzsche, and he thinks Nietzsche recognized the abandonment by being, but because he was interpreting it out of the plight, through a kind of not in the plight actually, but he was interpreting it through the guiding question, Heidegger calls it, and we'll talk more about that later. But basically Heidegger thinks that this guiding question is where we've gone astray. We've gone down this path, and this path is the path that philosophy's gone down is what he calls the guiding question, and Nietzsche was interpreting the abandonment by being through the lens of this guiding question, so through the lens of philosophy as it was, and so he didn't get to the original question of being because he hadn't recognized that. So he picked up on the idea that beings have been abandoned by being, but because he was kind of laboring under the mistakes of past philosophers, he wasn't able to get to the original question of being, and because of that he saw the abandonment by being as nihilism. And that was an interesting little aside that came out of this section. So we'll move into, so we're still talking about the resonating, but we'll talk a little bit about this idea of machination, or technology is what I called it in the last video. So machination, it's not a human activity. It's not producing machines or making things, or instead it's a mode of being. It's a way of being in the world, and it's a way of being in which it's a schema we apply to the world and to beings in the world, and it's a schema of thorough and calculable explainability. So machination, technology, is this idea that everything is explainable, everything is calculable. And it's also, another quote is, it's an interpretation of beings in which their makeability comes to the fore. So exactly what I said earlier, we're just overlaying this interpretive schema onto the world, and that's what machination is. So beings lose whatever it is that makes them special, as they all become reducible to the same thing by this interpretation. So it's again that idea, leveling down. Everything is fundamentally the same, and that's something that Heidegger was very much opposed to. Again, everything is made or can be made. Everything's possible. Everything can be made if only the will exists to make it. But this is the case. This is true. Everything can be made only because we interpret beings in the mode of machination, because we've predefined what beings are. And so because of that, because we've interpreted beings as makeable, then everything becomes either made or able to be made. So that's machination. There are three laws he sees as operative under this schema, and when these are in effect, they basically culminate in the greatest plight. So the first is, the more machination there is, the more it conceals itself. The second law, the more machination conceals itself, the more it predominates over what appears to be its opposite, lived experience. And third, the more lived experience grounds correctness and truth, the more hopeless it is that machination will be recognized and understood. So it's kind of like this self-perpetuating cycle, right? And that's machination. And the last section we're going to look at, or the last topic under this idea of the resonating, is science. So Heidegger has a unfriendly relationship with science, but again, we have to remember it's not like, I don't think anyway, for me personally, definitely science isn't bad. It's not saying that science isn't good or we shouldn't be making scientific discoveries or trying to improve our science. It's about balance. It's about keeping the idea that science is good in its domain, but it's not the only domain. And that, I think, is where we've gone astray these days, where basically science is everything. And if it doesn't have a scientific explanation, or doesn't cash out in scientific terms, we disregard it, or it's disregarded. Everything comes back to physics, basically. Movements of particles, or in biology the same. It's all chemistry, or the way that that explanation of how things work again bypasses something more fundamental, something more original, in Heidegger's words. So science, what does Heidegger say about this? Science itself is not knowledge, he thinks, first of all, in the sense that knowledge is a grounding and preserving of an essential truth. So science doesn't get to any real essential truths, therefore it's not knowledge. Instead, science is a derived instituting of knowledge, i.e., and this is a quote, a machinational showcasing of a domain of correct findings. So it doesn't get to the ground of beings, Heidegger thinks, because it describes them as pre-given. It describes them, and it accepts them as pre-given. It doesn't question them. It doesn't question how they came to be as beings. It just takes them as what they are and then describes them. Describes how they interact with each other, or what their effect on, what this being's effect on that being is. It goes through that kind of process, but it doesn't investigate the beings themselves. It just accepts them as kind of brute facts, brute existence. So since it does that, it's therefore derivative, grounded in the deeper truth of being with a Y, i.e. why beings appear as beings in the first place. That's, remember, Heidegger's goal throughout this whole process. What is being? Which is why do beings appear the way that they do? And he thinks that science is not going to be able to answer that question, because science looks past it. It doesn't even ask the question. It just takes what's there and describes them. It describes them really well. It describes them perfectly. But it's missed that question. It doesn't go down that road. And that's the road that Heidegger's interested in. So science values findings or results over the things themselves. And that's why science is not real knowledge. And in relation to humanities, Heidegger has an interesting thing to say. So he says, science must be exact to be rigorous. But for the humanities, it's the opposite. Science must be inexact to be rigorous. And this, however, this inexactness is not a deficiency. It's the merit of the humanities. In science, exactness is possible only because its domain of investigation is clearly prescribed, i.e. beings, physical things. It doesn't, once you have a clearly prescribed domain, then it's relatively easy to take that domain and break it apart, see how it works, see what beings are doing within that domain. But for the humanities, humanities will never be exact in this way, and philosophy, precisely because their domain of inquiry goes beneath this level, goes beneath the certainty possible when one delimits one's domain of investigation. So philosophy deals with lived experience. It deals with the being with a Y. It looks at the source, the underlying, what are beings? It follows that question. And this is no longer a nice, clearly partitioned off segment of reality. It looks beyond that reality. It asks those deeper questions, which Heidegger's asking, which people haven't asked, and that's Heidegger's whole what's the word I'm looking for? Heidegger's whole project. That's what I'm after. Project in a nutshell. What is being, right? So that's the first section, the resonating. That's what that is. We'll take a look in the next video. We'll move on to, what is the next thing? We'll move on to the interplay, and yeah, we'll see how we go from there. So thanks for listening. Hopefully that's helped, and I'll catch you very shortly.